Good morning, good afternoon, and good night, wherever you're tuning in. We are Slava and Jonathan, bringing you the Side Quest podcast, where we talk about character development, stories, and all things that are world building. And we occasionally take side quests, because, frankly, that's how conversations work. Just as a reminder, this whole show is spoiler heavy. So sit back, tune in, and join us on this episode of Side Quest.
Well, hello, Slava.
Hello, Jonathan.
It seems like I could feel your breath in the air.
Is it chilly?
No, it's just your presence.
That's a good thing. Where I go, glad tidings I bring.
Well, I don't know about that, but where you go, there you are, so.
Are the colors bending in your room?
Okay, first off, you're not in my room. Secondly, nothing is bending in my room.
Well, that's a shame.
Anyway, nice to see you. Today we're talking about Warbreaker.
Which planet have we visited?
We are on Nalthis in the Cosmere. Slava and I have read this book before. This is your second time through?
Second and a half. Yeah, second and a half. Because I read it and then I revisited parts of it in the ebook version when I was doing research for things you don't need to know about. And
oh, man.
Inside joke, audience. So yeah, second. Let's just go with second. A second full read through. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Yeah. So second full read through, and this is my This has got to be like my sixth or so read. I guess this is a little surprise to me, but I think I understood the story better now than I did the first couple times, because the first couple times I really just fell in love with the prologue. And we can get into this here in a few minutes. But this time through, I realized that Sanderson wrote a coming-of-age story.
Yeah.
And we'll get into your complaints. Your unfounded complaints.
Well, that's why I love it. Like it's been established through, probably well-deserved ribbing for me that I love coming-of-age stories. And that's why Ciri specifically stands out to me. We'll get into that. And that's why Vivenna particularly annoys me for the reasons that she does, because this is a coming-of-age story. So, good catch.
I guess we'll just get into this then. So, all right, adventurers, make sure you hit that subscribe button so that you never miss a side quest. So, can you set the scene for us before we get back to Sanderson's writing and this being a coming-of-age story? I think this will fit in real well right after the quick overview from the scholar Slava. Slava the Scholar. You can be the sixth scholar.
I'm there. Me and Vasher will understand each other just fine. So, setting the scene, as they call it, we have two kingdoms, Idris and Halandren. Halandren is the most powerful kingdom on Nalthis, which is a planet in the Cosmere. Its capital is Teteller. It is unique for its jungle environment and the tears of Edgeglee, which grow nowhere else. It is home to the Halandren iridescent tones, the religion that supports and is led by the Returned. Idris is also a kingdom on Nalthis, but it's located in the large mountain range to the north, considered a rebel kingdom by Halandren and the royal court. We also have two sisters, Ciri and Vivenna, and we've been saying it wrong. It's Vivenna, or I've been saying it wrong. Little parenthetical note for everybody. Ciri is an attractive young woman, has the royal locks, and has poor control over them, allowing them to follow her moods naturally. This leads her to often have blonde hair the color of joy and excitement. Ciri is a hasty and impulsive youth, though she also has an inner steel, as proven by her ability to survive the court of gods and learning to control her hair in tense situations, such as her confrontation with a guy named Trellides. This is also emphasized by her stubbornness, which she uses to strengthen her in difficult situations. We have Vivenna. She is the tallest of the Indrian princesses. She's also the most put together. She is mentioned as being exceptionally good at keeping her emotions in check. Dedelin, The king himself is surprised at her ability to stay so unemotional and keep her hair black. We also have the Court of Gods, where there are returned the God King, specifically Lightsong, Blushweaver are two important gods for our story. And we have the priests. And we also have some characters, pun intended, Vasher and Nightblood. Vasher is one of the 5 scholars, and Nightblood is a sentient sword hell-bent on destroying evil. And then we have our antagonists, Denth and Tanfa. That is the world we find ourselves in, and all these characters play an integral role in our story.
I just want to pause a second on name pronunciation. The wonderful thing about these authors is they don't really care how you say their names. I think that the way that her name is read is Vivina, but you want to say Vivenna? I know who you're talking about. That's fine. Siri is Siri. I mean, yeah, based on how we use language. But yeah. So that is the book. This is the first book that I encourage people to read if they're trying to get into the Cosmere. Slava, you've read some short stories, this book, and The Way of Kings at the moment.
And the prologue of Words of Radiance.
Yep. He told me that he's getting ahead of himself, and then he has all these questions, as one does when you step into the Cosmere and you're intrigued by what's going on. However, the questions are to not be answered at the moment. So back to
I'm told.
Yes, back to what we were talking about at the beginning.
Coming of age?
Sanderson's writing. Yes, that's exactly correct. Again, I think this is my 6th or 7th time reading the book, and instead of rushing through it, not that I did that the first time, but I suppose in reflection, if I didn't get this the first few times I read it, or I've forgotten, I would say that perhaps I rushed through it. Well, first off, Sanderson wrote this on his honeymoon, which is why it's one of the few books that has more sex in it, and maybe the most amount of sex. Tastefully so, I think. But
yeah, well, tastefully and very toned down. And I don't remember a lot of sex. I remember there's descriptions of Ciri beginning to find a romantic and even sexual attraction to Sesebron. And I also remember Blushweaver being very flirtatious. But I don't remember any sex, like we read in King, where there's descriptive terms used.
Right. Sanderson doesn't do sex the way that other characters do sex, or other authors write about sex. So sex is like a key plot point in this, of like needing to give an heir, going through with the actions of it, and the priests tiptoeing around like, hey, you need to do your duties. This is your job. Only referring to Ciri as vessel because her entire position is just that she has a womb. So he writes about sex. It's just very different, right?
Yeah. The way an Indrian would talk about sex.
Sure.
There's an in-world joke for you.
Yeah, that's a fair counterpoint, I guess. Or addition. We'll call it addition. Yeah, so this is a coming-of-age story, which did you catch that on the first read-through? Because I don't think we talked about this.
Yeah. We didn't talk about it, but I caught it.
Okay.
And we never addressed it in our discussions because I just thought that was common knowledge.
No.
Just an understood fact.
No, people don't always, they don't catch the same things as we've learned in this podcast, right? Like,
yeah. And I would add to that, it's not explicitly stated
correct.
As it. But you have Ciri, who is younger than Vivenna, but only by a few years, and Ciri's 17 when she starts this trek. Vivenna is probably in her early 20s. So it's not even a classic, what you would expect from a coming-of-age story, like, 9, 10-year-olds learning the hard facts of life and going into their teenage years on some sort of adventure or whatever, and getting to learn a lesson. So these are both post the common or stereotypical age of coming-of-age stories, but it has that element. And I guarantee you that's why you didn't pick up on it, and I never thought to mention it, because to me this is not a classic coming-of-age story. It's just a story that's similar elements because it has a young woman and they go on adventures, and those adventures and hardships give them the appropriate amount of lessons, that they learn lessons, and then they are better for it at the end of the story.
Correct. Yeah. Let's rabbit trail here for a second, especially because we just finished it. What are some key elements that you would use to define a story that is classified as coming of age? Needs to have children, right?
Young children.
Or ignorant? Can we say ignorant? Because Vivina and Ciri are not children.
But they're very ignorant of the world that's
That's
beyond
why I'm thinking ignorance is
the hills of Idris, or the mountains
immature.
of Idris.
Immature.
Very
immature characters who
Yeah.
don't understand the world.
Yeah, but I would define it this way, because you can have those things in a child,
Yes.
but you could also have an innocent child that goes through the same things that normally children do in these kind of plots. So to answer your question, it has to be, in Slava's opinion, it has to be preteen, because most of the ones that I read, they're all preteens or just going into teens. They find themselves in a world that's beyond them, that's harsh, that's brutal, and they have to learn a lesson, whether it's they're going on an adventure, something in their immediate family is happening that's destructive and abusive or just difficult because of the outside forces. We can use it as an example. The 7 losers all come from different walks of life, all have different problems personally, all have to go through a different arc, a different character arc, but they have one unifying goal. It's to beat it and to get away from the bullies and to kind of maneuver the landscape of their parents and this town that's, evil. So young children having to learn about life at an early age and are being thrown into the big bad world. That to me is like the Sparks Notes described to a 5-year-old, through Slava's prism of what a coming of age story should be. This is something that doesn't jump out at you on the pages of Warbreaker, because you have older children.
Mm-hmm.
They're both thrown into the adventure, not in a way that I have found that's typical in coming of age stories. And I might be splitting hairs with that one, but
I don't think so.
That's where I'm at.
I don't think so, because I was going to split those hairs of like, hey, you said that they need to be preteen. These people are in their 20s, and one of them 17 going on 18. I think that it's a fine like first draft of a definition. That's why earlier I used the word immature characters, whether it's amnesia or children or protected from the outside world because they're heretics, whatever. I think a coming of age story can be simply an immature character almost regardless of age. And I say almost because, we're coming up with this definition on the fly. So that's the kickback that I would give on that.
My retort to you on that, and then we can move on, is coming of age. Like, if you're 20 and you learn a lesson, you're not coming of age. You are of age learning a lesson. A 9-year-old who doesn't have the capacity to understand the evil of it, the disparaging way teachers act towards you, the bullies, and your parents' complete apathy towards you because your brother died, and then your brother died, a 9, 10, 11-year-old boy going through all that at an early age, ill-prepared for those things, and those things strengthening them and giving him resolve, and then him coming of age because of that. That's my coming of age definition. And I think that stands more firmly than a 20-year-old girl learning a lesson, as good of a story as it is. But there are elements of coming of age here, because
and I realize that maybe our audience feels like we're pedantic, so we'll move on here. But the phrase coming of age, I think, is a different way to say immature, because we both know old people in their 60s who haven't learned a damn thing. That their coming of age is they need to learn that the world has changed and the way that you used to do them is not how you're allowed to do them anymore. So I think the classic phrase of coming of age is, you're correct. But anyway, we'll move on. Okay, Slava, let's do a quick side quest. Share with us your complaints about the characters, because that'll drive us forward in the discussion here.
We'll start with Ciri. I like Ciri because I identify with her as a character. the way she deals with things in her world, like being stubborn, being quick on her feet, jumping in and doing things despite being totally afraid and ill prepared and not understanding, being ignored by her family because she's not like them. All those things are part of, my history. I did those things when I was a kid. Like, I was impulsive, I was stubborn, and my stubbornness, impulsiveness, and quick-headedness, both hard-headedness and quick-headedness, I just made up a word, helped me deal with the things around me. And so I identify with her. And sometimes it's just an immaterial thing, if I may use such a word here, where you're reading about a character or you meet somebody and there's just something about him that's just like, yep, I kind of like this person. So that's Siri. Vivenna reminds me of some fundamental Baptists I knew when I was young. They were starchy, they were pig-headed, they were ignorant about, let's say this is the Bible. They were ignorant about their Bible because they read the Bible, they consumed the Bible, they know more Bible than me in terms of how much they memorized of the Bible, but they don't know how to expand. They don't know how to describe what's going on in a particular passage, and they misapply them everywhere. There's no life in them almost, and that's kind of like a harsh term, but they're just bland. They're And Vivenna, throughout the story, is very ignorant. And I'm not saying she doesn't know things. She knows plenty of things. She knows more than Siri about all the things she needs to know or the things she needs to do in the court of gods. How to hold a fork, how to sit, when to address the king, when not to address the king. But I guarantee you, all that book knowledge, I'm using air quotes right now, won't prepare her for anything. And her interaction with the world, that's the only way I can phrase it today, just drives me insane. This is not to say, I want to stress this, that she's a poorly written character. Because often that's the thing that people go to. Oh, she was badly written. No, she's really well written, and she evokes emotion, just like Siri does, just like Blue Fingers does, and Lightsong does. But that's because they are well-written characters. So anyway, that's why I do not like Vivenna. But it's her starchiness. She's starch. She's ignorant, just like a surface-level ignorance, where you're like, really? You're doing this? Like, you're 22. You're a princess. You have had the access to the best education, and more than just book education. You were supposedly, you had tutors that were beyond just memorize the code of the Idrians. So without going on a very long tangent, that is the surface level of my dislike for Vivenna.
Right. Yeah. So this is because I've been thinking about your distaste for half of our cast, right? Like, it's primarily Ciri and Vivenna. Vasher does play a part, Denth does play a part, but they're really side dishes compared to the main characters' POVs that we follow, right?
And that's how I set up the mise en scene, is 2 kingdoms and 2 sisters. That was on purpose.
Yeah, and as you should, because that's how the story's written. But your distaste has made me question and think through this, which is how I came to this idea of like, oh, Sanderson did what he always does, is he prepares someone experientially for a task and then thrusts them into something else, because that forces them to engage with what they don't know. In this instance, it happens to be a very protected class, which is princesses, right? The women are then taken out of their roles that they've been living, and they're thrust into the exact opposite, which forces them to go, I don't know what's going on. Which is why you blatantly see Vivenna having these clear moments of ignorance and, dare I say, privilege in the streets of Halandrin, because she doesn't know anything else and she thinks she's doing a right thing. But there's a moment, and this is getting into what we'll discuss in the next episode, so I just want to say it and move on, is seeming like she's talking down, and then Vasher questions her like, maybe you're on the wrong side. And then the story moves on. And it's like, it's a question that should be asked in all of the opinions that we hold, is maybe our opinion is an opinion and it's not actually verifiable and it's not actually valid. And to your credit, and I think that this is good and it's something to note because we've talked about this in other books, is sometimes characters are supposed to be blatantly ignorant who have no idea what's going on. And the goal is to go, why are you being an idiot?
Absolutely. And the fun thing for me and part of this podcast is we go on side quests and we nitpick stuff. That's the fun part of this thing. And why we get along is because we like nitpicking. And I will
Join us for the next nitpicking session, folks.
Yeah. Yep. Side quest, the nitpicking. That sounds like a good fantasy video game. And that's why when you read a well-written character, you'll be like, what the bleep is going on here? And you can cheer for Ciri, and then you can be like, shut up, Vivenna. And that's good. That doesn't make it a bad story.
Well, and she's supposed to be. Honestly.
Right, and she's supposed to be. And having met a few different Vivennas in my life, I understand, because I lived among them, so I understand how difficult it would be to deal with Vivenna when you're a Vasher or when you're Ciri. And I'm like, oh, wow, this is just blatantly stupid. Why are you doing this, Vivenna? Or this is blatantly just annoying of you. Stop annoying people. Just be normal. The beauty of literature and books like this is you can read this and enjoy it for different reasons and come to Vivenna and go, yeah, I get why Vivenna's Vivenna, and move on. Or you can be like me and be like, what the hell's going on? That's the beauty of this book, but particularly because Sanderson wrote it so well.
Yeah. Yeah, which is honestly why I like it as an intro to the Cosmere, because, and let's get into the prologue here. The magic system, the introduction to the magic system happens in the prologue, and one of Sanderson's telltale signs is he doesn't go, hey everybody, here's the magic system. He just shows you what the magic can do, and then leaves you questioning with like, wait.
Right.
Because, and this is, I've memorized this because I love it so much. The opening line, first, it draws us to intrigue. It's funny, Vasher thought, how many things start with him being thrown in prison. Period. Okay. If you've read nothing else of this book, who's Vasher? What else has gone on in his life? And how many times has he been thrown into prison? And also, what's he doing here now? First line.
Right.
That's the opener. And I go, shoot. And I challenge people. I say, look, if you can read this prologue and put the book down, you're better than I am. Because I couldn't. I was hooked. I was like, wait a second.
Well, same. And let me set the scene again for the audience. Is we're talking about doing this podcast. This is like now 3 years ago. You say to me, so we're going to do fantasy books, right? And I'm like, sure, as long as they're not dragons in Middle England in 1400. And you're like, well, I got something for you. Read it. Let me know what you think. It's a different kind of fantasy. And I was like, all right. And you told me the same spiel that you just said to the audience. I read that line and I was like, yeah, it's a good line. But I heard you say it 17 times now trying to get me to read the book. And I was like, all right. I'm like, oh, well, that's interesting. He's awakening a figure from straw. Huh. The figure gets the key. I'm like, okay, well, that's kind of silly, but I'm intrigued. And then he overhears, or we hear him overhear in the story, Nightblood, and people like screaming and yelling and somebody talking about a sword. And you're like, well, that's interesting. I like some good old gratuitous violence once in a while. And then he goes and talks to this guy named Var and takes his breaths. And you're like, he's taking his breaths. And then there's colors involved, and colors and breaths are somehow connected. And then he strangles him with a scarf. And then he grabs his sword, which is sticking out of some guy's chest. And you're like, all right, well, let's do this. And you're thrown into the world of Idris now. And you get Ciri and Adelin and Vivina right away. And you're like, okay, so the princesses. And then things just pick up right away. And even in the slow moments, because Sanderson writes people well, and we had the discussion on Way of Kings about this, does he write women well? He does. And then I think we sort of came to the conclusion that he overall writes people really well, and therefore his women are interesting characters. They're not one-dimensional or two-dimensional cutouts of either bimbos or femme fatales. So you get this girl Ciri, you get the king, you get the Vivenna, you get other things, you get Maud, or Mab, excuse me. I didn't put it down in the prologue because I was already interested. But probably after chapter 1, I was like, all right, this is something that I definitely want to read. And you and I went back and forth in text, and I said, thank God that this is not knights in Old England with dragons. Because I'm not disparaging that genre of fantasy. I read a few books like that. I never liked them, except for Lord of the Rings. Somehow that stood out to me as interesting, and The Hobbit, I love them. We've talked about The Hobbit. I love it. But somehow the offshoots of those just bored me to death. And this one, from the first line to the last line of this book, I was like, wow, this is a fantasy book unlike any other that I read, and now I want more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And again, thinking back to your first read through, if you could bullet point the elements that stood out to you, what were 3 to 5 of those? Because I feel like you brush stroked a lot of things, but like
I did. Yeah.
we know that your perspective and my perspective are different. So what are 3 to 5? This stood out, this stood out, this stood out, whatever, that drew you in.
The one thing that stood out right away are the characters. They are enticing or captivating. The book captivates you because you have, again, we're going with Siri, not because I like her so much more than any other characters, although I do.
But you do, right?
But I do. But it's the first one we were introduced after the prologue. She's not doing what's expected of her. Okay, that by itself is not interesting at all. But you're endeared to the character the way Sanderson describes even her running through the streets of Idris, her hair flowing back, changing colors, and you're thinking, what the hell are colors, and what do they have to do with anything? So that goes into point 2. The magic system is fascinating, because later on in like chapters 30 plus, 40s, late 30s, early 40s, the chapters when Vasher describes tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, you're like, oh, well, that kind of makes sense. Everything I read, which I did follow along, it's like if I read, physics books, I could follow along because, I like science. I read science blogs once in a while. I did pretty well in high school. I understand the basic principles of science, but I'm not an astrophysicist or a physicist at all. So there's some things that I wouldn't get. I mean, like, yeah, I understand these words and I think I understand how the process works, but I would need a deeper explanation for me to go, that's what they mean by this law. Or this is how, this law is interpreted and its logical consequences in the world. So the same thing here. You're given this magic system, which you can follow along, and you understand after a while, breaths, you can give a breath, you can take a breath. The more breaths you have, the more color you have. The more color you have, the higher in the tier system or the caste system you are. You live longer, you're impervious to, attacks and sickness and all sorts of things. You heal faster. Oh, I get this. But then when you get it explained by Vasher, you're like, oh, wow, it's so much deeper. So we have the characters, we have the magic system, and the other thing that stood out to me is how the worlds themselves view each other, the cities, view each other. The two competing world views within the world, I found the way they're written very interesting. And that goes into why Vivenna is so starchy and annoying sometimes. It's because of her worldview and how she interprets her world. Those 3 things are what captivated me.
That's similar for myself. As I said, the prologue stood out to me because of the characters, because I don't think I've read a book with a talking sword before. Vasher is a captivating character, and to use your word, the magic system. This is what everything that I love about Warbreaker starts in the prologue.
Yep.
The writing, the characters, the plot, that's different. Nobody gets thrown in prison on purpose. Interesting. Oh, he's got to force this guy to give him something, but clearly there's a time limit because you're in prison. So if the alarm was sounded, because I don't know, it starts off with a really great hook.
It does.
So everything I love about Warbreaker starts in the prologue.
So let me ask you a question. I'm curious now. How did you get introduced to Sanderson?
I bought Way of Kings years ago because it was recommended when I was looking for additional fantasy books to read. And then I didn't like Michael Kramer because I audiobook stuff, so I never read it. And then a buddy of mine read Way of Kings, and he told me, you've got to give it a chance. I don't know what your deal is with your narrator or whatever, but you've got to give it a chance. It's really, really good. And I was like, all right, fine. And then I got into it and I was like, oh, shoot, this is really good. What I didn't know is that Warbreaker, at the time when I was reading these, I didn't know that Warbreaker, the Cosmere, Way of Kings were all connected.
Mm.
So some of the things we talked about off screen, which I'm not going to mention for the people, and I would hope that you respect the same thing if they haven't read Words of Radiance or the things that you've researched, they were all a surprise to me, which is really fun. And that's
Very
part of
fun.
why I don't want you reading ahead, because I want to get the surprise. We won't go down that road again. I'm just restating. There's fun surprises ahead in this journey and the thing is, we don't have all the questions answered. Spencer and I, literally every time we get a new Sanderson book, we'll read it in 3 days and we'll go, hey, you want to go get a drink? Let's chat.
Right.
Yeah, this, and then we theory craft and whatever, which is what makes this fun, because Sanderson continues to use mystery and intrigue to draw us in, because he's telling the layer 1 story, if I can call it that, of the book that you're reading with the characters that are in it. And then there's the second tier story, which is the Cosmere, and in the latest secret projects and also the book that was released before that, which is the Lost Metal, which is Mistborn Era 2, Book 7 in the Mistborn series. We have questions about what Layer 3 is going to be, because the Cosmere at the moment, to just give a statement or two about the bigger workings of what's going on, is every planet has shards. We talked about that in Way of Kings. Shards are basically gods over planets, and then those gods didn't become gods until an event called the Shattering of Adonalsium, which it was the god of gods. And you're like, oh, that's where creation started. Okay, cool, whatever. I'm trying to think about how to say this with like giving enough information and not too much.
Well, that's why you're not Sanderson. He can do that really well.
Oh, for sure.
Why do you think I had the reaction I did to the prologue of Words of Radiance that I did? Because I have read Warbreaker, I have read The Way of Kings, I have done some research on Coppermind Wiki.
Oh, I know. I saw your questions.
Yeah. So Coppermind, for those who don't know, is this massive encyclopedia of all things Sanderson. And it has like 5 subsites. So fantastic resource. But the way Brandon Sanderson writes those mysteries and writes those connections are spectacular. Because you read a book, whether it's a standalone like Warbreaker or it's Way of Kings, Words of Radiance, their series, you have the story of Yasna and her family and Kaladin and the Spren, and you have the vignettes between a few chapters or before every chapter, right? The epigraphs and epilogue. The epilogues of each book are part of the same story. They tell the same story from different point of views. You have all this, which is complex in itself. And then you have your main story, and you're like, that's great. And what you think is just a throwaway line, sometimes it's connected to a bigger thing. And what you think is just a natural course of events, forget throwaway lines, natural course of events are happening, and you're like, oh, that's great. And then you read another book, or you get to the epilogue, and you're like, wait, what the what?
Mm-hmm.
Hence my reaction for the prologue of Words of Radiance, because now I'm like, oh, what is this thing that Yasna has seen?
Right, so let me finish my statement and let's move on. There was an event called the Shattering of Adonalsium. The gods, the shards, came into being. Leave that there. But in the Lost Metal, and this is spoilers, so if you don't want this, fast forward a minute and a half, because we won't talk about it. He talks about things that happened before the Shattering. And so I call this Layer 3 of the Cosmere, because we have even less answers about anything that's there. This is the first information that we've gotten. And so as you're following these books and you get a little more and you're like, I have to wait another X amount of years to get the next book in this series. So Mistborn's next book won't come out until like 2027. It's 2024. Stormlight Archives book 5, because there's 2 5-book arcs. Book 5 doesn't come out until the end of 2025. So that's a year away. Then he's going to take 10 to 15 years of our physical time off, and then he will start writing the 5 back-end arcs, or the back-end arc of Stormlight Archives, the 5 back books, which take about 2 years apiece. So we're not getting another Stormlight book for 17 years, roughly. 12 to 17 years.
I don't know how I feel about that.
Here's the thing. He's released every year. And if you haven't checked this out, it's like very fun that he does this as an author. He releases what does he call it? He calls it the State of the Sanderson.
Yep.
Where at the end of the year on his birthday or just before, he releases a very long blog post about the year in reflection, things that he's working on, things that he can talk about, things that he alludes to because he can't talk about them, and then his rough idea of the next schedule. So when I first got into Sanderson, and we'll have to keep going on the book here in a minute because this episode is mostly just about Sanderson at this point, is he was talking about writing a follow-up to Warbreaker. Because I got in after Words of Radiance. I was reading Words of Radiance and Warbreaker, or not Warbreaker. I was reading Words of Radiance, and Oathbringer just came out. So book 3. And I was like, oh, cool. And then I'm so glad that that's when I started reading these, because then I got to read Oathbringer, which solves a lot of, well, it doesn't actually solve more than it brings up the question. It furthers the appetite, right? And then Era 2 of Mistborn, which is basically a Western, which is fun. So Era 1 of Mistborn is like Victorian era England-ish. And then Era 2 is like 1,000 years later after the end of book 3 of Mistborn. And so Era 2, books 4, 5, 6, and 7 in Mistborn are a Western. And so he plays with genres too, but it's like in the same world with the same magic system, but the magic system has devolved a little bit due to just the passing of time. And the thing is, he's got this mastermind map that exists somewhere that he is weaving this layer 2 story together. And as a quick reminder, if you forgot how I labeled these things, because I want to be Vasher a lot of times, layer 1 is the book that you're reading and the plot of the start to finish of the pages. Layer 2 is the Cosmere as a whole, from what we've understood in general of like, oh, there's shards and whatever, what's going on between planets, et cetera, et cetera. Layer 3 is beginning the questions of, okay, what is going on before the beginning event, Shattering of Ad Elysium, in Layer 2, because we just got a hint that there were things before this and we don't have any information. It's so complex and wonderful, which is why people like Spencer and I are so geeked on it, because we're like, this is a call out to Matt and his fiance, where it's like, no, this is an entirely new intellectual property that is doing new fun things. And it's partly new and fun because Sanderson has his 3 laws of magic, which keep him in line. And I don't want to give full, like, the only credit to that, because he's actually much more prolific writer for the fantasy genre than I think that people give him credit for, because it's like, oh, Brandon Sanderson. Spencer and I have a friend who's like, oh, Brango Sander, like, his books are so great, and he just makes fun of us, and we're like, look, you don't have to like them, that's fine, but there's a reason he keeps getting more popular, because he writes human characters. We've talked about this. He writes characters that are intriguing. He also writes characters who are handicapped sometimes and like have issues that are real, like depression and suicidal thoughts, like Kaladin, and people that are relatable to us.
Non-Balat.
Well, that's a you problem.
If you know, you know. But let's get back to the book. I think the setup in chapter 1. So you really like the prologue. I really like the prologue. You like it more than me. I like chapter 1 because, as I said a few minutes ago, after reading the prologue, I was like, okay, Jonathan has a point. Let's see where it goes. And then chapter 1, I'm like, oh, I like it. So chapter 1, King Dedelin is discussing the possibility of this war, a disastrous war with Hallandren, with his general named Yarda. And Yarda is trying to convince Dedelin that they could keep Hallandren at bay longer if they kept the treaty. And I'm like, what treaty? What is this treaty? Why does the treaty involve giving away a daughter to the God King? What is the Many War? Which comes up later, I think. But I'm like,
yep.
Okay, there's a war. And then these people are rebels, or so the Hallandren kingdom thinks. But you're like, wait a minute. Halfway through the book, you're like, but these princesses are also returned because they have some of the power of the returned. And you're like, what is going on? And Dedelin, the king, goes, you know what? We can keep them in bay for a little longer if we give them my daughter. And in fact, hey, the audience is told Vivenna has been training her whole life to be the God King's daughter. And then you're like, who's the God King? And she's been learning all the rules of the court and all the theology of the Helendrians to basically be the God King's wife.
Vessel.
Yeah. Fantastic. The king goes, you know what? That's a good idea, General Yarda, but I'm going to give them Ciri instead. And you're like, wait a minute. The Ciri that I just saw running through the streets, changing her hair color, she's a princess, but she hangs out in the kitchen with Mab, and she plays with the kids in the streets of Idris. So you kind of get the idea that Idris is really small, like almost provincial kind of kingdom.
Yeah.
And then that's really, revealed that it really is. And then she's going to be given the God King. And you're like, Delvin is a shitty dad. Because you kind of get the idea that he's just getting rid of the problem child. And you're like, wow. And so all that is packed into chapter 1. And then the story goes right into it. Chapter 1 is, I think, an hour to read. And in chapter 2, you have Ciri sitting in the carriage on her way to Halandrin. Terrified, confused. This is like a last-minute switch. And she must wed the king. So she's like, oh, so I'm going to be married to the king. And so she's like, oh, my God, this is, a city of just pomp and opulence. And there's heretics here because they're reawaking items and they're reawaking dead bodies. I'm going to marry the guy who's in charge of all this. So you have Ciri going through his existential crisis. You have Vivenna back home going, I was prepared for this. Now I have no purpose. And Ciri, who's overlooked for all of her life, because she's the middle child and the rebellious one, is all of a sudden thrust into the forefront of everything. And Vivenna gets to take a back seat. And Vivenna's kind of, butthurt about it.
Would you not be?
I would be, sure.
Yeah. She spent 22 years of her life preparing for this one event. It's like an Olympic athlete. What is it? Usain Bolt has a quote where he says, I spent 4 years for 9 seconds. For one 9-second moment.
Yeah. Yeah. I understand why Vivenna's upset. I'm a rational, reasonable man. I understand why she's butthurt.
Sometimes.
Yeah. And while she's butthurt, Ciri is wishing Vivenna was here in her stead because she is sure her relative political experiences would make her a better fit. So she's like, well, Vivenna's prepared for this. She should be here, not me. Why am I here? It's just a good introduction. It's a good setup.
It sets the scene. It's a mise en scène.
So there's a couple of settings of the scenes. There's the Vasher thing, because we meet him again later on. There's Ciri in the kitchen. There's Vivenna, butthurt. There's Ciri, terrified, in the carriage. And then you have Ciri in the God King's palace. You have Vivenna showing up, trying to rescue her, although it's not as altruistic as we think. All of a sudden, Vivenna's thrust into the underbelly of Halandrin, while Ciri is trying to seduce the king without any experience, any sexual experience, because the priests are like, yeah, go seduce the king, just don't talk to him.
Do your duty, but don't touch him.
And she's like, well, I don't know a lot about sex. Yeah, I don't know a lot about sex, but
I think we have to touch. I don't know, but I think we do.
Right, and the priest is like, yeah, I guess, I don't know. Go do your thing, vessel. You have Ciri with the mercenaries. I mean, Vivenna with the mercenaries. You get Ciri with the priests. Then you get Ciri with the God King. Then you get Vivenna with some of the people the mercenaries set her up to meet. And this is like a continuing story. The wheels are just turning. Everything is happening all at once. And you're just immersed into this world. You don't want to leave.
Mm-hmm.
Such a palpable, story that Brandon, yep, that's it.
Brandon
Sanderson.
That's good.
Sanderson wrote.
I like
Right?
that.
Yeah.
Brandon. Come here, Brandon.
That's just shorten the name, Branson. So, yeah, meaty. The story's so meaty.
It is meaty. This gets into a point that I made earlier. I actually think the pacing of this book is correct. Because I used to tell people, well, the prologue's really good, and then it gets slowed down because you have these two characters that kind of slow the story down. And I was reading it this time, and I was like, no. This is the right pacing. This is the correct pacing of we don't know what's going on. We've never been in this world before. We don't know who these people are. We don't know the cultures. We don't know the conflict.
But we get enough to understand both for the magic system, both for the conflict, both for the characters. Vasher's lack of background information, but we kind of get him a little bit. You're like, okay, this guy is doing something. In chapter 5, where he stands atop a wall surrounding the court of gods, and he realizes that Ciri is complicating his plans. What frickin' plans, Vasher? You throw yourself into prison, and you have a sword that talks. What plans do you have? But you still kind of get the feeling that he's the good guy.
What makes that stick out?
I would say his internal dialogue. That's it.
When do we get his internal dialogue?
So we get it in chapter 5, the event that I just referenced of him standing on the wall. We get his talks with Nightblood here and there. And then we have him, and this is not internal dialogue, then we have him talking with Vivenna, even after he kidnaps her. You don't get the sense he's a bad guy. I don't. I think he, if anything, on the first read-through, he was kind of the outlier, if you will.
The reason I challenge that is because we don't really get his point of view in most of the story from an internal monologue type of way.
Now, very few instances where we get his thought.
We get it in the opening line. It's funny, Vasher thought, how many things begin with me being thrown in prison. Okay, the prologue is his point of view. Then we have snippets is even too large of him standing on the wall, watching Vivenna, him being in the town, capturing Vivenna, him being felt in specific places. Like, we don't get a whole lot of time with him. And that was originally my complaint the first few times I read this book is, I want more Vasher. Well, I got more of him in a different book in the Cosmere. I just didn't know it at the time. We'll just leave that right there. And so that's why I challenge it, right?
Yeah, and that's fair, fine.
It's not a bad thing. It's just a thing. It's just the nature of the plot.
But when he's described and the snippets light that we get of his internal dialogue, the first read through, second read through, the first read through means more here than anything.
Mm-hmm.
I did not think of him as an antagonist.
Okay, that's fair.
So, yeah.
That's fair. As this episode comes to a close, are there any other key moments that you want to talk about regarding the plot before we end this episode and invite the adventurers back for episode 2 of Warbreaker?
Yes, we can talk about Sanderson's Laws of Magic. I think that will be a great setup for the next episode, which I'd like to challenge you. We dive into more of the plot, because this was a good setup. We dissect the plot next episode, and then get the guests back on the third to discuss both.
Yes.
Get their reactions.
We have a new guest this time.
We do.
Friend of yours.
Yep. It's his first read of Brandon Sanderson. He's left some notes in our working doc that seem like he's enjoying it. I'll get his thoughts later as I would prepare for episode 3. But yes, Casey, a friend of mine, a friend of me, I think, right? Whatever. My friend Casey will be here for part 3. But magic system. You are the resident expert. I want you to tell me Sanderson's Laws of Magic.
Sure. I'll give you a brief overview, and then we'll leave it on a cliffhanger. One of the things that Brandon Sanderson is known for is his magic systems. And I was actually just watching a video of his sometime earlier, if not this week, the week before, possibly 2 weeks before. But he was invited to this panel to discuss magic systems early on in his writing career. He was like, oh, great. I bet everyone has laws for magic. I can't wait to hear what they have to say, even though he's on the panel. He started listening to them when he got there on their panel. They were talking about soft magic systems where it's just like, oh, well, we use magic for this and we use magic for that. And then they were like, all right, Brandon, what do you think? And he said, well, and I'm going to slaughter it, so I wish I could reference the material that he talks about is, well, with magic systems, everybody knows that you have to start with laws. He's not trying to belittle them. He wants to have a foundation that the magic is built on so that there's ways in how the magic works so that there is really no room for Deus Ex Machina because he shows the limitations. So that's the brief overview. Now, I will give you a quick definition of each of the laws because there's 3 of them. That's it. As complex as he can be, he also tries to be simple, right? And so some of the most wonderfully complex things are the most simple. I want to just drop like a Blaise Pascal proverb in here. 25,000 monks will be thrown up in arms over the price of a cowl of wool. You think about that one. Anyway, Sanderson's first law of magic is an author's ability to solve conflict with magic is directly proportional to how well the reader understands magic.
The specific magic in the book, though.
Yes, how well the reader understands said magic. So yeah, that's a great comment, Slava. I'm going to read all three of them real quick, and then we can have a quick chat on it.
Yep.
So first law is an author's ability to solve conflict with magic is directly proportional to how well the reader understands said magic. Sanderson's second law goes like this. Limitations are greater than powers. Third law is expand what you already have before you add something new.
Beautiful.
So those are the three laws. Over to you. You've read a few short stories, Warbreaker and The Way of Kings. Do you feel like these laws are held to well, not well, or neutral?
Well, and the first one is indispensable.
Oh yeah, it's the foundation.
Absolutely. Why I think he does it well, my grading of Sanderson, is all the books that I read and the short stories, I understand the magic system enough where I'm not confused or bored or think it's just out of this freaking world, which goes into the second law. Well, this world. It's out of this world, but it's not out of the world that he's building, right? It's believable in-world believability. So colors, for example, when we're first introduced to them, Vasher, the author talks about him in respect to Vasher. Vasher talking to Var. Var giving up his breaths. Vasher having a talking sword. Awakening, heightening, the returned. All these things are presented without much definition given or a lengthy exposition, like 7 pages on what awakening is. You don't get that.
Right.
But you get it in bits and pieces. It's like a tasting menu where instead of, meatloaf and potatoes and an apple pie for dessert, you get a fantastic 17-course meal. And you get a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And then by the time that you finish your meal, you're like, oh, awakening. Awakening is the use of breaths to bring inanimate objects to life. Draining color from nearby. And that's because because color is important in this magic system.
Yep.
Because there's the god of colors. The actions of the awakened objects are dependent on the command used at the time of the awakening. You're like, oh, okay, thanks, Vasher, when he explains that. And maybe some readers will get that before Vasher explains anything. And so these breaths, they're used to awaken an object and then can be recovered. That's why Vasher awakens the little straw man who gets him the keys. He takes his breath back. That's why Var gives him the breaths. That's why he uses a cloak that's awakened to choke Var to death. All that makes sense. The reader of Warbreaker or Way of Kings, and moving on to Words of Radiance, the little bit that I jumped into, it's the same system, though, so it's not like we're comparing the two books. But let's compare Warbreaker and Stormlight Archives, because that's more fair. In both systems, you're like, oh, okay, I get it. I understand. And then when it's explained in full, you're like, oh, dude, that's even more impressive than I thought.
Mm-hmm.
That explains the background. That gives a more meat to it, to use my analogy from before. And the third law, you can't get rid of it. This is for anything that you're building, whether it's a magic system, a world, your Stephen King talking about it, your Brandon Sanderson talking about the Cosmere, I forget the guy's name, but the guy who wrote James Bond, which is a completely different genre, right? Ian Fleming. Whatever you're doing, make sure James Bond is James Bond and expand on his story throughout every book. And I've never read Ian Fleming, but I'm just saying it as an example. What would make Ian Fleming stand out as an author if he did that? What I do know is Brandon Sanderson does this, and that's why we have 5-book series and 21 books in the Cosmere, because he's slowly expanding. It's that tasting menu analogy again. You're slowly getting a wider view of this world that is the Cosmere. And that's what makes it freaking fantastic. you don't want to put it down. And this is me not fanboying out, because I honestly prefer horror, transgressive, weird books like Clockwork Orange or Philip K. Dick. I like his stuff because it's just weird and out there. That's my go-to. So as a newbie in the fantasy world, and as a definitely newbie in the Sanderson world, he does these things so well that as a complete noob, I'm like, yep, he does that. And that's what makes it work.
I have to offer a correction on just one thing. Warbreaker and Stormlight Archives are not the same. They happen, and I understand what you meant, but I need to clarify something for the audience because this is relevant as people get into the Cosmere. It's both a fun thing to discover and whatever else, but like the magic system on each planet is unique. Hard stop, period. So they're not the same. It happens in the same universe, and part of the discovery of the journey of the Cosmere is learning how he can do that with integrity and like having still a unified story, because that's a really interesting thing that gets unpacked primarily in the Stormlight Archives. And I'm not trying to be pedantic. This is like actually a very important note. Is the universe is the same. The magic systems, and we were using magic systems, which is why I'm pointing this out, are very different. And it's fun to find out how he decided to link these things together.
Right. And I thought I corrected myself mid-sentence, but maybe you didn't hear, or maybe I didn't do it well enough. Having said all that, I think this is a perfect place to land the plane.
I agree.
And revisit our friends in Haladrin, because by the time we come back, Idris is long behind us, far behind us, and nobody cares what Dedelin and whatever his general's name is are talking about. We're now in the throes of political espionage and all sorts of intrigue. Thank you for joining us today. Be sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss out on the next literary jaunt, only on SideQuest.
Goodbye, adventurers.